This is quite a lively group. We're so glad to have you all in the program in a couple of minutes. Thanks. Well, good afternoon again, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Kelton Harris, and I'm one of the HR consultants here in FAS Human Resources. And on behalf of FAS HR and the FAS Diversity Team, I want to welcome you to this year's summer panel. And our theme is storytelling. From the Moth to NPR, to Harvard's Day of Inclusion and Belonging, the power and value of storytelling is being recognized and harnessed in many, many circles. The truth is, we all have a story to tell. And telling our stories allow us to be more authentic. It allows us to be more authentic with ourselves and with others. It also allows us to be more transparent and to show some vulnerabilities that we sometimes try to hide. It humanizes us more. So today we are fortunate to have a wonderfully diverse panel that includes authors and masters at storytelling, as well as a talented facilitator who's going to lead a rich discussion. So I don't want to take much more time from this, and at this point I'm going to move along and ask Annie McGaugh, one of our HR coordinators, to come forward and introduce our panel. And Annie and Sam Sweeney were instrumental in making sure that today was such the success that it is. And so let's give her a round of applause as she comes forward.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annie McGough, and I'm an HR coordinator at FAS Human Resources. As an author and enthusiast of children's literature myself, I've been looking forward to this panel, and based on how quickly our event sold out, it seems like I'm in real good company right now. And this is also an exciting way to begin our 2017-2018 Diversity Dialogue Series, which will be centered on the theme of storytelling this year. Sharing stories is more than just an entertaining pastime. It's a way to share our history and experiences, to heal, to inspire, and to express deep truths. Stories allow us to see ourselves and to see each other more fully. In fact, psychological studies have shown that fiction enhances readers' sense of empathy. By dedicating ourselves to fictional worlds, we have a greater capacity to understand ourselves and each other in the real world. But what happens to the voices that don't get to share or hear their stories? The Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin found that in 2016, of the 3,400 children's books published, only 427 were written or illustrated by people of color. That's only 12% of the children's literature published that year. In 2015, the CCBC found that animals and objects with human characteristics were more likely to appear in children's books than African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, or Native Americans. We Need Diverse Books is an organization dedicated to changing these statistics. Through mentorships, classroom initiatives, and other forms of advocacy, they work toward a world in which all children can see themselves in the pages of a book. One book that can help readers see themselves is Flying Lessons and Other Stories. A collection of short stories for middle grade readers, Flying Lessons and Other Stories was developed by We Need Diverse Books in collaboration with Random House Children's Books. With starred reviews from Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and School Library Journal, Flying Lessons and Other Stories is a heartbreaking and heartwarming anthology about family, love, and how we define our own stories. We are so fortunate to have several individuals on the panel who are involved with publishing this book. Ellen O., We Need Diverse Books founder and CEO, is the editor of Flying Lessons and Other Stories, to which she also contributed. A former corporate attorney, Ellen is the author of the young adult fantasy trilogy, The Prophecy series, and the middle grade novel Spirit Hunters, and the sequel to that is coming out very soon. Saman Chanani is a fellow contributor to Flying Lessons and Other Stories, a graduate of Harvard University, go Crimson, and Columbia's MFA program in film. Soman has worked as a screenwriter and director in addition to being the author of the School for Good and Evil fantasy series. Amitha Knight is the social media manager for We Need Diverse Books and a writer of children's literature. A graduate of MIT and Tufts University with a degree in medicine, Amitha has received awards for her writing from Penn New England and the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. Moderating our panel today is broadcast journalist and radio presenter Callie Crosley. She's appeared on national programs such as the PBS NewsHour and CNN's Reliable Sources, and is a regular contributor on Public Radio International's The Takeaway. Locally, she appears on WGBH's Beat the Press, which examines media coverage of major stories, and Basic Black, which focuses on events concerning people of color in the Boston area and beyond. So without much further ado, let's give them all a round of applause as our panel begins.
I think it's important to begin with a story. That's my own story, which is my true confession. I have known about We Need Diverse Books for some time, and I'm all in. I love it, love it, love it. So that's the lens of which you're going to hear this conversation. I can't just say more about it. I've had the opportunity to interview some other writers who are represented in the book and who are not. When Jacqueline Woodson came through, she was on my radio show, and I asked her about We Need Diverse Books, and she had a very strong and powerful statement to make. And so I have not yet, except for now, to meet the people behind the scenes who have been pulling it all together. And this book is just an example of that. I was reading it when I first got it downtown at lunch. And a lady came up to me and said, "Oh my God!" And like, "Are you a teacher?" And I said, "No." And she said, "This is a great book. I'm using it in my classroom." And I said, "Very good." So you should be happy to know that out in Boston, there's someone who was thrilled to see that I was reading the book. So let's start at the beginning to get people to understand what We Need Diverse Books is all about, and really how it came to be. Ellen.
Okay, so this is a long answer, but I'll make it brief. So basically what happened was in 2014, we had a series of events that occurred. One, Walter Dean Myers Sr. and his son, Christopher Myers, wrote 2 op-ed pieces in the New York Times talking about the apartheid of children's literature and how not much had changed in literature, even though Walter Dean Myers had been writing books for, decades. And then BookCon happened. If you guys know what BookCon is, which is part of the Book Expo America, they announced their, not even a month later, announced their power lineup. And the first lineup was all white men. And all the white women authors were very angry. And all the writers of color said, "Welcome to our world." Yeah. Not even a week later, they announced their 30, star guest lineup for BookCon, which was their power day of meet the celebrities and meet all the writers. And there was not one single diverse author in that lineup except for the grumpy cat. So there were more cats than people of color represented at BookCon, and now, now it became really obvious how problematic the issue was. And for the first time, a growing number of people started to use social media to kind of raise their voices. And we came up with this idea of using a hashtag campaign. We need diverse books. But not just the hashtag, but to add to it that, the visual component as to why it's so important. And I don't think any of us could have realized how moving or how touching it could be, but being able to see people post pictures of their kids, to say, a mother posting a picture of her 3 black sons and saying, we need diverse books because my sons can be heroes too. And LGBT teen posting, we need diverse books because maybe I wouldn't have tried to kill myself if only I had seen that it was okay to be gay, it was okay to be trans, and that we can stop this othering. And what's the most powerful thing about books? Books, like Anne was saying, causes empathy. And if you don't start that young in children, how do we end up where we are now, where you see hate, and violence and things that are erupting around us? Maybe that wouldn't be as problematic if we had just shown kids at a young age that the other is not something to be afraid of or to hate, that the other is a person just like you, just like me. And that's kind of where, what started We Need Diverse Books, the ability to teach kids how important it is to have empathy for others and to start it in children's literature. So the anthology, of course, is kind of just another great way to push that mission forward and say, here are stories for kids to read that show that everyone is a person, and that if you can have empathy for another person, maybe that will stop like this misinformation and the lack of empathy that we can kind of see happening.
So what's interesting is that the Huffington Post at the end of last year did 5 trends in YA literature or fiction, and the book and this group represents 2 of them. One was diversity is strong. That was their #1 trend. And down below it was a short story revival. If you've never tried to write a book, actually it's harder to write short stories than a novel. So this is quite an accomplishment on several levels, both from a literature standpoint and a writing standpoint, and also from a storytelling standpoint. So Ellen, I'd love you to read, because this is the output, one of the biggest output of We Need Diverse Book, the foreword to the book, so that people understand what we mean by storytelling. And because authors are notorious for never bringing the book, Salman will allow her to read my book that I brought.
I am notorious for that. Okay. All right. Just a short story. It took me 10 tries to get the foreword for this book. Like, my editor did not like any of my previous attempts. And I was just writing the foreword. Okay. So, dear reader, when I was little, I found an abandoned kitten on the street. It was mangy, flea-ridden, and mean, but so cute. I loved it. We lived in an apartment building that had a no pets allowed sign in the lobby, but I didn't care. I'd always wanted a pet. I mean, I had a baby sister, but she wasn't as fun as a kitten. I was determined to take it home, even though I knew my parents would be mad because it was against the rules. So I scooped George up. Yeah, I had already named him George. I tucked him close to my chest and I headed home. But by the time I walked the 5 blocks to my building, I was a wreck. I looked like a monster. Not only did George manage to scratch up my entire face and chest, but he also taught me that I was terribly allergic to cats. My eyes swelled into leaky water balloons, and I was covered in huge welts that looked like radioactive leeches had attached themselves all over my body. My parents totally freaked out. When my dad took George away from me, I yelled through my swollen throat, "That's my cat!" And as I reached for my pet, he hissed at me and scratched me one last time in goodbye. Turns out George wasn't alone. All cats hate me. Which is why now I own a dog. Actually, I own 2 dogs. but I will never forget George. He's the story my parents love to bring up every time family reunion happened, and about how I saved a poor orphan kitten that tried to kill me. But we all have stories like that, right? They might be milk snorting out of your nose funny ones, or listen to how cool and awesome we are ones, or come close so we can whisper in your ears juicy ones. They might be old favorites or stories about new experiences. But no matter what, our stories are unique, just like we are. And that is what this book is all about. 10 diverse stories from 10 great authors for all of us.
So Soman and Amitha, I want you to get into this conversation. Soman, how did you come up with the story that is actually the signature story for the book, Flying Lessons? It's a little bit different from what you normally are known for, which is fantasy.
Well, it started because Ellen, and my editor, I write the School for Good and Evil series, which is so wildly different from this. I basically write a 600 to 800 page book a year that is essentially kind of like a Game of Thrones-y universe for kids. There's 140 characters. It's just the most massive, mind-boggling thing, and it makes me sweat and have night sweats every day. And so Phoebe Ye used to be the editor of that series, and then she moved to Random House, and we had always wanted to work on something else, but never had the chance because I was over at a different publisher. And Ellen and I had been friends for a while, and we all had breakfast at Alice's Teacup in New York. And Ellen had come up with this juggernaut of We Need Diverse Books, like it had become this national phenomenon, and we were thinking about what authors could do to help push it forward. And Ellen knew the story of my grandmother. My grandmother basically was the driving force in my life, in the sense of my mom was a very young mother. I felt like she was a very anxious mother. And she often would just sort of turn us over to my grandmother to take care of us for long stretches of time, including the summer, the entire summer. And so me and my grandmother had a special bond because we're both, how do I put this? We're both very high maintenance, and she at some point realized this. We shared the same birthday, and my grandmother decided to tell my mom that she wanted to take me on a cruise alone to Alaska when I was 10 years old. And that started this tradition of my grandmother taking me alone on trips every summer while my brothers went off to camp and did everything else. And I was telling Ellen this story about how on one of the first trips my grandmother took me to, she took me to Spain. And she took me to the beach because she wanted to get her hair done. And she's like, I'm going to leave you on this beach. I was 11 years old, I think. She's like, I'm going to leave you on this beach and I'll be back in 3 hours. And I remember being on this beach, and she was in a fur coat. That's the other thing I remember. She wore a fur coat to the beach. And as she's leaving, I remember watching her walk away. I'm in the middle of Spain on the beach, and I'm like, Grandma. And she turns around, and I'm like, everybody on this beach is naked. And she looks around. I remember her eyes narrowing because she suddenly realized what she was throwing me into. And it was a choice between getting her hair done and taking me with her wherever she was going. And she just looked at me, and I remember she looked at me and she smiled and she goes, I don't see anything. And she walked away. And so Ellen and I used to bond. I used to tell her all my grandmother's stories. She had her own stories. And we just kept talking about the fact that, especially when you're a commercially minded author, you don't get to write these stories. You know what I mean? Like the demands of the genre sort of almost prohibit you from doing personal stories because they won't necessarily find an audience, especially We Need Diverse Books. And so that's when I think we came up with this idea. What if we collected 10 authors who could tell their most personal story? And I think that was the mandate. Everybody had to tell a story that was deeply, deeply personal to them. And telling the story of my grandmother, which I'd always wanted to do, I took more care with this story, and just because of the difficulty of getting a short story right, than anything I've ever done in my life. I was just like, this has to be perfect for so many different reasons. Matching up to the level of talent in this book, plus the mission of We Need Diverse Books, plus honoring the most important person in my entire life. So that's where it all came from. And so it's so funny, every time I see that, every book gives you a different feeling, I guess the same way that every child would give you a different feeling. And so, when I see this book, I just get this kind of little bouncy, swell in my heart, because I just remember the feeling of writing this story,
I'm going to have you read a section from it, but I wondered just if you would just speak about the importance for you of We Need Diverse Books, because you talked about saying the authors need to check in, but why? You know, a lot of people might not understand that.
I think because before it started, the idea that you know, you could write a big commercial novel with characters of color, I think was not possible. Like, there was a lot of things where you couldn't have that kind of character on the cover. You never saw characters on big novels that were not white, you know, and if they weren't white, they would make them white somehow, you know, like they would Beyonce them on the cover, and suddenly there would be a totally different shade than, you know, the character in the book. And so I was this thing where when writing The School for Good and Evil, the whole point of the School for Good and Evil series is to subvert the tropes of Disney, to take all the sort of whitewashed, black and white way of thinking from Disney and undo it. But I had to do that by sort of working within the constraints of the genre. And I think We Need Diverse Books has totally kind of, you know, thrown that out the window. And now we can sort of rewrite the rules.
Well, I think there's this myth that happened, which we've kind of debunked now, that books by authors of color don't sell. And one of the proudest moments for us was to see Nicola Yoon hit the New York Times bestsellers list, Jackie Woodson, Kwame Alexander, and of course, WNDB's first grant winner, Angie Thomas, with The Hate You Give, has been sitting at the #1 spot for months now. And so we couldn't be prouder of that, because that's a very important message to say. These books sell. They really do. There is a demand. And that's part of one of the things that we were able to kind of address.
Well, it's funny because books also followed, like, everyone learns the same lesson and then forgets, right? Hollywood for many years had figured out that, like, if you make diverse movies, especially diverse romantic comedies, when you had also like that whole stretch with Whitney Houston in a lot of movies, like The Bodyguard and Waiting to Exhale, they were minting money on those movies. You had this renaissance of amazing sort of like, you know, mainstream, high budget sort of like romances featuring characters of color, and then they forgot about it. Right? And then now, and then like it takes another 10, 15 years for it to come back. And it's same thing with books. Like, I don't think this will be the last time we have this conversation. You know what I mean? At some point,
Sadly, yes.
Unfortunately, like it'll go out, it'll come back, you know, so.
Well, Amitha, I want to bring you into this conversation. I suppose if you're going to have a social media manager, one that graduated from MIT, pretty good, I have to say. But you write books. Well, you're not in this collection, but you do write books. And I'd like you to talk about why We Need Diverse Books and the publication of this anthology is so important.
Well, I was a fan of We Need Diverse Books, the hashtag, when it came out, so I was excited to join the organization because it does matter so much. As a writer myself, it never even occurred to me that I could be a writer, because I don't know, I didn't know anyone who was an author. And when I read books growing up, they were all mostly white people. And when you don't see other people like you being writers, you kind of limit your imagination. Everyone that I knew who was Indian was a family member or a colleague of my father's who was a doctor. And so that was kind of the natural progression for me. That's what I thought. I was good at science. I enjoyed science. This is for me. Never mind that I'm always sitting in the corner writing stories and reading, and my favorite activity was reading a book. So it just really matters. Just seeing you reflected on the page is just such a profound thing. And the funny thing is that even though I said this, I didn't really understand what I was saying until I read stories like Soma, when I was like, wow, this is what white kids have been feeling this whole time. They read these stories that are just like them, or they see their families, like something about their mom, and it's just so powerful. And as a mom, my kids are biracial, and trying to buy books for them so that they can have that same experience is just very difficult.
Yes. So we were mentioning earlier that the penetration of authors of color in YA is about 12%, which is probably overrated, I'm guessing. So, and I was curious because, Ellen, you have spoken about something called casual diversity, in that you bring some other people into your circle, into appreciating the stories, the experiences, having the feeling that Amitha just said, through a kind of casualness. It's not a, here it is, read it,
Right.
and know about diversity.
Right.
Would you explain that concept?
Well, I think we all know kids do not like being lectured, right? Number one thing my kids are saying to me, would you stop lecturing me? So I think a book that sounds like it's lecturing you on diversity is kind of the worst thing to give to any kid. And casual diversity really is the ability to say, hey, a black kid can be anything in the story. It doesn't have to be an issue book about being black, right? Or it's not that book about Asian. I mean, not that it isn't important, and I think that immigrant experience story is a good one to have. But I would love to read a book where the Asian kid's not that stereotypical immigrant, and they're just like, you know, doing cheer group or like running track, and they're just the hero of their own story without having to have diversity and the issues around it hammering at you. Not that you don't want them there. I mean, racism is a real part of our life experiences, so to erase that is problematic also. So, you know, but that casual diversity is to be able to have a story that isn't an issue one, that isn't issue driven.
Amitha, respond to that if you would.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, just to be able to, like, my favorite books are fantasy novels. That's what I read. I loved Lord of the Rings growing up. But I don't know, somehow it never occurred to me that I would see that there were other people trying to write fantasy books featuring characters of color. And actually, my first story that I co-wrote with my twin sister was my attempt to be like, oh, I can write an Indian Harry Potter. And kind of going through the rejection process and kind of meeting other writers of color and realizing how many people were not getting published. It was kind of an eye-opening experience at how naive I had been previously about why these books were not out there. And it was kind of an anger moment, I guess, like, why weren't these books out there? I'm meeting people who are writing these books. How come I didn't see those growing up? So.
Well, speaking of Lord of the Rings, if I may. So Sarwat Chadha is a British Indian author, and he writes the Ash Mystery series. And he was actually talking to a British independent bookseller about stocking his book there. And the bookseller said, I don't see any need to stock your book. And he said, why? And he said, well, I don't have any Indians in my neighborhood. To which Sarwat replied, I bet you don't have any hobbits in your neighborhood either. So this is like, you know, those kind of like microaggression moments where you don't realize that you said something racist, but it actually is in the core. So.
I was curious if of the fantasy, because a number of you write fantasy, if that is because you can be especially free in that space with regard to issues of diversity and race. I, you know, harken back to the big deal that Star Trek made when Uhuru was there, because, you know, people said, well, how could that be? Well, there's just space. It's thousands of years ahead. If you're in good and evil, it's someplace else. If you're in the Chronicle and the trilogy that you're writing, Ellen, it's not there. As a kid, the book, my favorite book was Pippa Longstocking, and I know exactly why, because I needed a different person, but that would make me feel safe, that somebody else was different, but it still was a little bit of fantasy. I'd like you to speak to that, Soman.
I mean, I think also the thing with fantasy, when I write the School for Good and Evil series, is this idea that there's no labels in the woods, right? And in this world, there's no labels. So race appears, obviously, because you still have, you know, people of different colors and stuff, but it doesn't come with the same history, right? And it doesn't come with the same experience and all that stuff, which allows you to really shake things up. And I think, you know, that sort of founding principle applies to everything I write in that series of what happens if you take away history and experience and you just let people be on an equal level. And then you can have as Ellen said, you can have these fun moments where not everything becomes about sort of the baggage of past history. That said, because I'm sort of undoing the damage that Disney has caused in this series, I worked with the sort of tropes of the blonde white princess, you know, the evil witch, you know, the prince who looks like all princes in Disney movies. And now that I'm further on in the series, I have a main character for the next trilogy who is a black girl, 15 years old, who comes in and basically is like, you know, you guys have been brainwashed to think stories go a certain way, and once I'm in it, you don't know what to do with me, right? So suddenly you have like this intersection of you know, a different perspective. So you know, that's something I can get by having a world that isn't bound by, you know, rules.
I feel I should mention that you've said that Disney was actually your whole world when you grew up, so you've not had nice things to say. So you might want to explain.
Yeah, it's funny because I've gotten in trouble for this before by talking about this with Disney publicists in the audience. I grew up in a house that didn't have cable or internet or video games or anything. And my parents didn't know what to get me and my two brothers to watch to keep us busy. And so my grandparents sort of came in one day and was like, everybody loves Disney. So they bought all 50 Disney cartoons on tape. And that's all I watched from when I was about 6 to about 16. Like about 10 years of watching Disney movies over and over again. To this day, I can quote any Disney movie, basically. And so, you know, you grow up with that as your brain space, and like that's where I sort of learned everything about storytelling, about structure, about, you know, characters and everything. But there is nothing as whitewashed as that sort of period in Disney, from like, you know, the 60s or 70s until the mid-90s. And so I came to Harvard. I took Maria Tatar's seminar, and it was just 10 of us. And I remember that was the class where I learned what fairy tales actually were, which were, you know, came from the Grimms. They were survival guides to life. They were much darker and richer and filled with horror and all sorts of, you know, nuance that weren't in the Disney stories. And that's when suddenly, like, that sort of odd feeling that I always used to get from Disney movies of that sort of fairy tale fantasy that was not for me, right? Disney movies at once made me feel very like safe and also anxious because they made me feel like, you know, they weren't my world. And yet I was forced to imbibe it Clockwork Orange style for and so taking that class made me think, oh, wait a second, like these stories are actually completely lies, right? These are not the real stories. If you look at The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen and the Disney version, Disney basically takes the exact same story and then changes the ending. So the moral of the story actually, you know, is completely reversed. You know, and Ariel becomes a hero when actually she's the villain of the original story, really, and that's why she dies at the end. So, you know, that sort of lodged in my brain. Then Harry Potter came out, and I saw the opportunity to really sort of take Disney and reclaim fairy tales from it, you know, and it was an ambitious thing to want to do, but I felt like in doing it I could sort of exercise my childhood, you know.
Your Disney demons.
Yes,
my Disney
right.
demons, which I, you know, still have. So
Let's talk about some of the obstacles to publishing, because what often authors of color run up against is people saying, yeah, I see these, and I see that you have stories like everybody else, but, you know, most people don't relate. Most people are not going to see themselves in your story if your main characters are not what we expect them to be. Amitha, let me start with you. How do you begin to even to make a dent then and to change minds about that if that is a prevailing attitude with the gatekeeper?
Well, one thing that We Need Diverse Books is doing is trying to change the faces of people who are the gatekeepers so that they can perhaps help with that aspect, see the manuscripts coming in and say, hey, I have not read this before, and this is a story that I was looking for, versus someone who, you know, has diversity on their mind, and they say, okay, we've already had one Indian author, why don't we look for, you know, a disabled author, and they feel like they're checking diversity boxes rather than reading it on its own merits and realizing, even if it is the same story about pirates, that the fact that it's a diverse author in and of itself is kind of groundbreaking, because to be that author, to write that story is, I don't know, it's just a mental leap. It's that, like I said before, you just don't see yourself as an author who's allowed to write those stories and those characters, and it's just really sad to me.
I wonder, Ellen, if in at this current time where there's so much action going on in social media, and you can answer this as well, where people feel like they can take control in ways that they haven't, that there is more of an opportunity for distribution and actually publication. I mean, this is a traditional publisher, but are there ways now where we can see other stories popping up and other perspectives in ways that just would not going to happen? And in that way, it makes a wider space for we need diverse books.
I don't know how to answer it because I think traditional publishing still is kind of like the way to really best market and promote your book. I mean, they are the way to get to, especially for children's literature, they are the ones that get to the librarians and the teachers. So I'm not seeing a lot of like different avenues. As every once in a while you hear about a story where somebody kind of breaks through with a self-published book. And so I don't really know the answer to that because I'm kind of traditionally published. But what I do like about what social media has done is to allow people to criticize those books that are problematic. Although there's a lot of pushback that happens too, of course. It's like, oh, you know, this is censorship. And we're like, no, we're not censoring. We're just telling you that's racist. Or, you know, and then it's like, no, you know, it almost feels like being called a racist is the worst thing in the world that could happen to a white person. Seriously, try living through racism. It's far more difficult. I promise you. Being called a racist is really, it's just a word. Having somebody spit at you, threaten you, send you, you know, death and rape threats, like things that we have to deal with, like not only just microaggressions, but macroaggressions, that's our daily lives. So I wish people would stop saying, oh, that's just the worst thing that could happen to me. It's not. What it is a conversation starter. And I do like to say one thing. I don't like to call people racist, but we have to be aware of the fact that we live in a time that has systemic racism embedded in our culture. And what we need to do is be able to look inside ourselves and say, that's a problematic thing. Let's have that conversation. Let's take the steps to see how we can fix it. And that's what social media has allowed us to do much more effectively than before, and to have a much broader reach. So what I see happening is the conversations changing.
And Soman, when you crack the ceiling, if you will, as you have done, and people may not know that your first book is commissioned or has been commissioned for a movie. Is that still happening?
Yep, Universal bought the rights the day it came out. And so you're talking about going through a process. Working with a movie studio is like trying to get a bill through Congress.
Right, yeah.
So,
but you're writing the script as well.
Yeah, it's all done. The script's done. We're getting a director on soon, and hopefully we'll be off to the races.
And this is the School for Good and Evil.
School for Good and Evil, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's been an interesting process because, you know, Ellen knows this. My sort of biggest strength has always also been marketing. In addition to writing books, I've always been a lover of how to bring something, a concept, to an audience, you know. And one of the things with whether it was Flying Lessons or School for Good and Evil is the fact that, like, if you have diversity in it, how do you make it feel real, right? How do you make it feel that, like, you're not just putting in token characters? Because that's also a problem we see all the time. Now that diversity has become a buzzword, you see authors put in little sidekicks.
Sidekicks. Everybody's a sidekick. Come on.
So, yeah, which it's very obvious when this is done. And so one of the things I just did it a couple weekends ago. I was thinking for the new book, because the new School for Good and Evil book comes out in September. It has a very diverse group of kids. And the 16 characters, 16 main characters, only I think 7 of them are white. And I thought, how do we make this feel real so that you can actually see what a diverse fantasy looks like? And one of my best friends is the casting director for 30 Rock. She had August off. She goes, why don't we just cast the kids? Why don't we cast all the kids as if we were making the movie, since Universal is taking their time? And why don't we shoot them each in an individual video as their character and make them feel alive? And I said, let's do it, right? So I funded it myself. We did it last weekend. We shot these 16 absolutely brilliant teenage characters, most of who are, you know, teenagers of color. And we'll start releasing them next Tuesday. And like just watching these little videos makes it feel so visceral that like you have these real kids, you know? And I just think like letting the fan base see that and see like real kids are now participating together in something that would have been exclusively white before
We should also note that you're a filmmaker, so my little video I might make with my friend Bob is going to be quite different than what you're doing. Just so we're clear.
Right.
It is true. But things like that, where I just thought, like, what's the priority here? The priority is to make this feel inclusive, right? So that it's no longer Disney, it's no longer Potter, it's no longer Lord of the Rings, it's no longer these things that feel like white stories, you know?
So when you break through, when you're the one that breaks through, and this is a little bit of how Jacqueline Woodson actually answered it. If people don't know Jacqueline Woodson, she's blown up in young YA fiction, young adult fiction. And there's something that is put on you, perhaps, if you feel the mission, that you've got to keep widening that space and bringing somebody behind and not allow them to shut the door and say, oh, there's nobody else. It's just you, Soman. You're just the most fabulous one. And that's it. So how do you deal with that? Or is that something that you found that you have to deal with?
It's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things that you see is that, you know, when you're coming up, you have certain people that you follow that become sort of your role models and whose careers, like, you know, you want yours to resemble somehow. And I think for me, what's been important is, as I keep writing, is the kids who come to you and they're like, I want to be a writer, right? And instead of being like, oh, I can't wait to read your book one day, right? It's like, I feel much more engaged with them, right? Especially because 80% of the kids who tell me this are kids of color. And I'm like, all right, this is what you have to do, right? And so I don't do it, I feel like I don't feel as much responsibility to you know, new writers who are trying to find an agent and things like that. I feel like they'll find their way, quality in the end, especially now that you know, the landscape's changing, they'll find their way. I'm more about giving kids who are coming up, who might end up, you know, taking a completely different path in life when they really want to be a writer, to feel like that's possible. And so that's one of the things I talk about at my school visits a lot is, if you want to be a writer, here's how you do it. And I have a YouTube channel called Ever Never TV about the good and evil sides of life. And we do these videos solely on, if you are a kid and you want to be a professional writer, here's what you have to do. And we do these complete tutorials with cartoons and everything to make them feel like no matter where you're from, you could be anywhere else anywhere in the world, any income bracket, you know, any race, here's how you can become a writer. So things like that.
Oh, well, that's good. Here's something else that I think is interesting. Now some of the biggest readers of YA fiction are adults. So there's a real opportunity for a movement, and I'm going to call it a movement, like We Need Diverse Books, to understand that the audience and what the takeaway is from small stories about growing up and rich different experiences is really what could be quite profound, because adults are finding their way to this. Ellen, speak to that if you would.
I actually like to write middle grade because there's less adult readers there. I like kid readers. I think in general, like why YA is so attractive to adults is that YA breaks a lot of rules, you know? And there aren't as much, I think, constraints to writing that adult writers face. And also, there's not a lot of bullshit in YA. It's as, you know, real and honest as you can get. So how do we address that? Well, I think one of the things that has helped We Need Diverse Books is the adult readership crossing over to YA. They've been huge supporters of diversity because I think, you know, especially for adult readers of color, they're like, well, this is something we haven't seen. This is something I didn't have when I was younger, and now I'm seeing how important it is. So they've really kind of embraced the cause from that aspect. So I think that, well, personally, I think this book also all adults should read, by the way. That's just an aside. But in general, I think YA is for everybody, but we can't forget that the issues relating to YA are for teen audiences too, which is, I think, very important because sometimes adults are like, this is so angsty. Oh my gosh, this is so, like, you know, childish. And I'm like, okay, so think of the audience that it's written for. Yeah, so like I think that what we want more is when adults do read these books to kind of embrace it from their inner child, you know, their inner teen spirit, which we still all have, right? We're all immature still.
Amita, is this a kind of stealth diversity going on for the adults that might pick this book up and and really resonate with a lot of the experiences maybe for the first time. Maybe they can hear it in the story that they couldn't hear.
I hope so, and I hope they're going to the bookstores and saying, where are the adult versions of these books? Why am I not reading these for me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested to know what is the next step for We Need Diverse Books in terms of how you're going to shape the next leg of this mission. You've got a book out. You've identified. I'm thinking about Kelly Baptiste. She won one of your contests for new authors. So you're continuing to fill up the pool of new writers with new experiences, which is exactly what you need. But what would look like success for you in terms of the next leg of this journey?
Success would be We Need Diverse Books going out of business.
Right.
I mean, that's the truth of it. And really having the only thing continue maybe is the Walter Award, because we represent the Walter Dean Myers legacy by providing this opportunity of an award for the most outstanding diverse book. And I personally think that is going to be our legacy too. We Need Diverse Books, to kind of keep that award going, to show that diverse books is, they're great books for everybody, and they're excellent. There isn't, sometimes people say, oh, it's diverse, so the quality is going to go down. Hell no. These books are excellent, and everyone should read them. And having that kind of ongoing legacy by supporting the Walter Award is, I think, what I hope to see in the future. And the need for kind of like the other things, like maybe mentorships or grants or internships, I'd love to see that need shrink, because you're seeing the reflection of the real world represented well in the publishing world. So that's where I'd like to see it head. I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, I thought racism was going to be better by the time I was an adult, and I had kids, and I'm wrong. So, I don't know what the future is. So, but I can only hope for the best.
And the other thing is, I don't know if something like We Need Diverse Books can, ultimately, it puts out a collection like this, which is just an amazing collection. I mean, I think everyone who reads it will agree, but it still needs, the schools, the state reading lists, like the entire
amplification.
To get behind it. And I think ultimately that's something that just has to happen from the educational community. Like, this is a book I think every kid in America should be reading. You know what I mean? Like, it should be required reading, because it will just change so many kids' lives and the way they think and everything. But Ellen alone and Amita and We Need Diverse Books can't do that, right? So that's the kind of support that ultimately will have to happen, for the amplification to occur.
And also, I think the importance is for kids actually to see writers of color is so important. I mean, I do school visits, and I have kids come up to me, but the one I won't ever forget is I was at a middle school event, and a black girl came up to me and said, I've always wanted to be a writer. I love writing, but I never thought I could be a writer until I saw you. And I said, but why? And she said, well, I've never seen a writer of color before. And I said, but Walter Dean Myers and Jacqueline Woodson, and there are these great writers. And she said to me, but I never saw them. As if, because I never saw them in person, they could not be real. And it really struck me that it's kind of really important to get our, all kids to see the diversity of the authors that are out there, as well as the diversity of books. Because it becomes that kind of idea of, well, if I have never seen it, it can't be real.
What about the whole universal concept that it's okay to have writer of color share an experience, but you've got to be hitting the universality. And if it at all does not hit a universal piece, then it's a problem for people to resonate who are not sharing your immediate experience.
But may I ask, what is that universality?
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
Is it the white
asking.
Experience?
Yeah.
Because I know that we read all these white books, and we can totally empathize and get into those stories and have no problem. But when it's a black book or an Asian book, white people are like, whoa. I mean, this is a true story. I was at a Barnes & Noble's, and I don't know if you guys know, The Mighty Miss Malone is this wonderful book, and has a black girl on the cover. It's a beautiful cover. And I saw a little white girl reading this book, and she was totally into it. I mean, she's like 3 chapters into it, right? And her mother came over and snatched it out of her hands and said, oh, no, honey, that's not for you. That book's not for you. And that, that happens for boys who want to read princess books, right? And girls who want to read books about martial arts. I mean, it happens all the time, these kind of like set ideologies that we have. We have to break that. That's internal. We're not even realizing we're disseminating it. So what is that universality is the question.
Exactly.
Is it the white experience? Because I think that we need to prove that that is not the universality. I think the universality is a good story.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking the Hobbit response is the same thing. I mean, how universal is throwing a ring into the volcano or, at the end of Lord of the Rings. So
it can be done. I mean, it's funny because I was thinking about, like, the first School for Good and Evil has 2 girls on it. And I was like, the book is pretty action-packed. And I'm a boy, and I feel like boys will like it just as much as girls. I remember fighting with the publisher being like, but are boys going to pick up a book with these 2 girls on it? And they're like, oh, we've sort of just like, girls are your audience. That's basically what they told me. And I remember going to schools, and I could see it in the boys' eyes that by the way I did the school presentation and described it, like they were interested, and yet the moment they saw the cover, like their face just sort of like fell. Not a problem anywhere else in the world, only in America. And so what I finally started telling them is, I would literally ask them, how many boys would buy this book if not for the cover? And you would see a good third to half of the crowd raise their hand. And then I still do it. I bring duct tape, and I just duct tape the cover. And I said, come buy one, I'll duct tape the cover for you. And you would be shocked at how many boys come up and buy that.
Wow.
And it just makes you realize, like, they want to read it. They're just, literally, there is a cover in the way. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so that's what you sort of have to get past somehow. And, if it requires duct tape, it requires duct tape.
Did Harry Potter help or hurt a diverse place in publishing, if you will? And by that I mean, there's so many, everybody's in the books, and it's very broad, and she wrote it that way intentionally. She's even gone back and changed the personal history of some of the characters to make that, if you will, even broader in terms of a response. And I'm always curious now, is because it was such a juggernaut, if what its impact on writers of color is.
I think Potter did 2 things. One, it gave all of us a career, right? Without Potter, there would be without Potter, there's no me. Without Potter, there's no YA. There's no We Read Diverse Books. There's nothing.
Without Potter, I wouldn't have started writing. To be honest.
So on the one level, it created the genre. On the other level, at the same time, you got 3 white lead characters, and I think that was the tricky part. That ultimately, for a while, everything mimics The Last Success, right? So everything that followed Potter was that same mold. Like the triangle somehow. Even Twilight came out of that. Hunger Games came out of that. Divergent came out of that. So it took We Need Diverse Books. It took some of the ones that are coming up now. It took Jason Reynolds. It took The Hate U Give to now. Now I think you're going to see things change. You're starting to hear about new titles coming out, new fantasies set in African kingdoms. Like you're seeing like the result of hits that feature diverse characters now going to spawn the copycats, right? But we'll take the copycats because that's what's ultimately going to generate the Black Harry Potter.
Yeah, because we need the bad diverse books too. I mean, not every diverse book has to be excellent and brilliant. I mean, white books are allowed to be bad, so we should have some bad ones too, and we will, that's just the nature of the game. But I think one of the things that I would love to say is, I have had people who have a problem with We Need Diverse Books say to me, you're trying to get rid of careers for white writers. You're just white genocide, And I'm like, okay, so literally, this is not about replacement. I wish we could kind of get rid of that idea. This is about inclusion. This is about adding. Make the table as big as you need it to be and just add more writers to that table. Now, true, it's hard because it's publishing, right? But I do believe that there's a story for everybody, and so there's a book for everybody. There's no reason for us to say, we've got one Black book, and so we don't need any more others, which we've heard. I've actually had somebody say, I already have an Asian book, so we don't need any more. I'm sure you've heard, I already have any whatever it is, they're going to say, we already have one, because all you need is the one. because
there's
that's all
one
there is, that one reader.
Tricky part about We Need Diverse Books, and I've had this conversation with Ellen before, and I'm curious about it, which is that when you're trying to foster inclusion, right? Often they'll come to We Need Diverse Books and Ellen for her opinion, and you'll get a book with diverse characters that is just not good or problematic, right?
Right.
So I think there's also that delicate balance of like letting that book come into the world and receive the public response, whatever it is, and also blocking it somehow. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Well, problematic is different from bad.
Right. So let's say problematic, right? How do you handle like a problematic book that maybe is written by a diverse author, but is just problematic, right? Do you let that come into the world as it is? Like, how do you handle that?
I call that the Tyler Perry of books. If I may.
How do you handle the Tyler Perry
I
books?
mean, I just say that mistakes are going to happen because this is the thing, is that people haven't been publishing these books. And so even the writers ourselves don't know what diversity always looks like. And so mistakes are going to be made. And we have to accept that if I, as someone who's not a gay author, if I write a gay character, it might not be the best gay character. But I'll do my research and I'll do my best. I'll accept the criticism that I didn't do this right.
Right, exactly.
And I'll move on. And I'll try again the next time and include that feedback that, that resonated with me and do better. That's what you do as a writer and an author. So you keep going. You make a mistake and you keep going.
See, Jacqueline Woodson said, and she wrote a beautiful post about how we know when white writers have not done their homework. We know when you haven't sat at our table and ate dinner with us and broke bread with us, right? You didn't do the work to get it right. I mean, if you're going to write a book about a neurosurgeon, you're going to do your research. Why aren't you going to do the research about something that you don't know, If you don't do the research, you end up with stereotypes, and then you have a problematic book. And I'm not for censorship, of course. I mean, there's a book out there with a Korean-American character that I hate more than life itself, but it's out there. It's won awards. People buy that book still. There's nothing I can do about it except hope for more and better representation to come. And that's all we can do. We can do better.
Okay. Amitha, you were on a panel few years ago about, which I hadn't even thought about this concept, but I guess it's here, is that a lot of books that have diverse themes are often on the banned books list, which is fascinating to me, which means that, you finally get the little penetration into the marketplace and then suddenly, now, can you all speak to whether or not that is because of the diversity themes or what's happening there, that many books that have the themes about diversity are ending up on the banned books list, and what's the result of that?
I mean, I think, like you said, I think it is a result of the diverse aspects of those books.
For sure.
And
okay.
people are not used to reading these kinds of books, and sometimes it feels wrong. Like, this, you're not supposed to write this in a book, and children shouldn't read this, and we should just stick to what we've been reading before. I think that that's part of it.
I think there's also not just the banned book list, there's the banned author list. Because when you're an author of color, like, School for Good and Evil, like, sales-wide, has sold even in the reddest parts of America, but I won't be invited there. It's just the way it goes. When we do the school tours, my tours always end up looking pretty blue in terms of where I go, because that's the places that'll have me. I've had visits canceled in some pretty red states before just getting there, and just because of interviews I've done or things like that, or they'll do research on my personal life, I'll get visits canceled because of that. And I think that is directly often related to the fact that I'm not who they would prefer to have. So though that happens, but I think ultimately if you just keep doing your work, you keep spreading the message, you keep focused on the goal, that's all you can control. Because as Alan said, not everything's going to be done in your lifetime. You know what I mean? You just have to kick the ball forward as much as you can.
Did you want to answer?
Well, I was going to say LGBT books especially are usually targeted the most. And I will tell you, one of the saddest stories I ever heard was when a librarian told me that he has to kind of, have a blind eye to when the LGBT books are stolen out of the library, because the kids need those books, but they're too afraid to take them out. So they're stealing them.
Wow.
Right? And so I would have librarians say, we need more of these books because I can't keep them in stock. because they need them and they're afraid of being seen with those books. And
Interesting.
God, that is heartbreaking. These are kids, middle school, high school. These are kids who need our support the most, and they can't even take a book and read it without fear of retaliation.
So many people are finding it hard to understand this statistics, which is that right now, as we're sitting here, the kids in kindergarten are majority minority. That's already happened. And we're moving toward 2054. So seems like we ought to have some literature, some culture, some other things that reflect this. Where are you all in seeing that maybe it's getting easier, or it's the same, or is nobody getting it yet? And we're in a fraught racial climate, that is true. So I'm just curious about, does the whole world not get that?
I would say watch the movie industry, because often Hollywood reflects cultural trends first, because going to a movie is sort of a much more like basic, pastime of families. And I think what's happening is the movies featuring diverse characters are starting to reliably do well. And the movies that have the sort of whitewashed cast, the all-white romantic comedy has disappeared, right? Because it no longer performs. And you're starting to see the whitewashed stories that are even putting white characters into characters meant for characters of color are failing. I think over the next 3 to 4 years, you're going to see that only movies that have diversity behind them are the ones that are really pushing forward. And I think once that happens, then you'll start to see a big shift in culture. You're already feeling it, but I think it's going to become much more obvious.
Well, I also think with children's literature is by and far filled with people who really care about kids. And that's the beautiful thing about it. It's why they embrace We Need Diverse Books so powerfully and have been behind us. Not just the publishers, but the librarians and the teachers. They really care because this is for the kids, right? So I think you'll see change happen more quickly in children's book, as we are already seeing, than in Hollywood. But eventually you'll see the catch-up, because Hollywood does tend to rely heavily on children's books for materials.
Yeah.
All right, Soman, I'm going to let you close this out with just one little excerpt from Flying Lessons, and then we're going to take your questions. I would like you to read from starting on page 149.
Okay. Let's see. Oh my God.
Up at the top.
All right. I asked you the names of your friends, Nani repeats, not looking at me. Oh, I can't remember, I say, suddenly focused on my shrimp. They were complicated names, Spanish ones. I see. And what did you do with these nameless friends? Swam and played ball, usual stuff. You should put the mussels in, Nani. I think you said to put those in before the... Did you speak to them in English or Spanish or English, she says. I don't see what, she glares at me. Or did you sit in the same spot for 2 hours watching a boy play ball with his friends after that very same boy offered you a chance to join in and you refused? I gawk at her eyes wide. Then I notice her hands. Hands bearing yesterday's nail polish. Hands that never made it to the Pink Peony nail salon. You were spying on me, I yell. The whole kitchen goes quiet. Teams of tourists leer at us, their dishes already plated. Nani and I shovel it on our furies and finish the paella. Well, Nani finishes. I just stew. Neither of us speak in the taxi ride back to the hotel, which is fine by me because my stomach feels like a kettlebell. I should have pretended to eat the other team's plate like Nani did and just made do with the olives and prosciutto. I wasn't spying on you, Santos, she says finally. I felt bad you spent yesterday in a cave, so today when I dropped you off, I waited to make sure you were okay. Then that boy hit you with his ball, and I was about to run down into the sand and give him a beating, but then I saw you talking to him. He even held out the racket as if he wanted you to play. When you pushed it away, I thought it was because you don't like sports. Your mother hates sports too, like your grandfather. But then instead of going for a walk or swimming or buying more ice cream, you just sat there staring at that boy after he left. I waited so long for you to get up that I almost missed my lunch, but you never moved. My stomach cramps tighten. I can feel my armpits sweating. I wasn't staring at him, I say coldly. She smiles at me. The wonderful thing about Europe is that you can stare at whoever you like and no one cares. I don't smile back. Grandma, I wasn't staring at him. The poison in my voice is so toxic the lightness vanishes from her face. Nani nods, biting at the edge of her lip before she peers through her window and I turn to look out mine. I relish the silence. Though it's a funny thing, she says. At your age, sometimes it's hard to know whether you like someone or whether you just want to be them. I turn sharply, but her eyes are locked out the window where they stay for the rest of the ride.
Flying lessons. Thank you all so much. Now we have time for your questions. Questions, please. Not comments. Over there.
Hi. So one of my best friends is having a baby, and I'm his godmother, which is very exciting. And he is black, but he's also Jamaican. And so I was having a conversation with his mother about how we needed to start looking for books for him now. Books that will represent him, not just the African-American experience, but also Caribbean as well. And I find that I seek out books like that for myself as well, because I read a lot, and I read a lot of books when I was younger that were a different experience. And now I seek out things that are, things that I can relate to a little bit more. I guess my question is, when you were talking about the exposure that you need for these books to be successful, and the support that you need maybe from these summer reading lists and things like that, have you guys formulated your own summer reading lists, or have you have? So how do you distribute those, and where would we find them? And because I have a lot of like-minded friends who would really appreciate supplementing their children's reading lists with their own as well. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you for asking that question. We used to do a summer reading series where we would say, if you like, okay, I'm totally going to tap my own book. If you like Percy Jackson, then try Ellen O's Prophecy, because they're action-filled stories, that are based on mythical fantasy culture from another country. And the way we kind of framed those were in order to show people that these were not like just issue books. So they were very popular, and we had them every summer throughout our Tumblr. And what we've now done is compiled all of them and a lot of lists into our app. WNDB now has an app available where it's a curated list of all the diverse books that are out there, and it's constantly being added to. So there's like a personal account available, and then there's like accounts for librarians and teachers, and it has a lot of like added content there too. So that's a great place to go and get kind of the list that you're talking about, because we actually had our IT people come up with what do you call that? The tagging, the meta tagging. Mm-hmm. So it literally tags every single book for every single kind of diverse storyline that will be represented in it. So you can like type in LGBT, and it'll give you a list of this, books, and etc. So it's a great app, and I hope people will check it out and play around with it. And thanks for asking.
It's also important to tell your librarians or whomever, because whenever I do my summer reading list for the last few years, I tell all the librarians I intend to discuss the book list for We Need Diverse Books. So you need to be up on it so we can talk about it. So that sort of gets it into the conversation as well. Other hands? Oh, in the back.
I have a question about the sort of supply and demand you were talking about earlier. Full disclosure, I'm married to a children's librarian who is in an independent school where my children go, and they are totally crazy about We Need Diverse Books. And the faculty at our school are all over the librarians, asking for more, asking for more, asking for curated lists. And it's an independent school, and we have a lot of authors come visit, a lot of diverse authors, and you all keep mentioning school visits, school visits, school visits. And I'm wondering, are these public schools you're going to? Are they independent schools? Because I know in our school, in the independent school world, K through 8, it's now diversity and academic excellence. There is no difference. And so the faculty and the teachers and librarians are absolutely pushing this forward at an alarming rate, because they feel like it's their only way to show their communities that they're academically enriched and they're striving for excellence. So I just want to get a sense of what's this like in the charter school area, in the arena, the public school arena, because I just don't have visibility into that. And is that not creating more of a pull on the publishers than a push from the publishers?
Well, there's two different kinds of school visits. There's the ones that publisher, you could talk about those.
Yeah, there's ones where you're like, whenever I go on tour, basically what happens is they'll choose the markets I'm going to. They put out a feeler to all the school districts, and then schools basically claim it, by offering, this is how many kids we'll have to visit, this is how much time we'll get, and basically the publisher chooses which ones are the most favorable. And so that ultimately comes down to which schools are the best supporter of school visits. And that's often where you'll see in certain cities, like if it's like a city like Boston, you might get like 100 offers. If you go to like, you know, the deep suburbs of Kansas, you'll get one, you know? So that's where you'll see that. But then there's another type of school visit, which is where they come to the author.
Yeah, so I mean, like most authors have a school visit page, and you can contact them and ask them to come and see if they can schedule a school visit. And of course, it's going to depend on schedule of the author, when that can be, and also fees. So we should talk about fees too, because that's especially for writers of color, they do need to get paid in order to make it to a lot of these school visits. But we usually are very flexible in terms of like, you know, working with a bunch of schools. And like, if let's say I'm coming to Boston for an event, I'll tag on 2 or 3 school visits and then give a reduced rate or things like that.
Or some authors won't even charge, like I don't charge a fee if I go to a school that I know can't afford it. What I'll ask instead is that they just buy books for kids.
Right.
And so that a lot of authors will do.
Yeah, we try to make it work, because for us, getting in front of the kids is the most important part of our job. Like, and you guys are great, and we love you. But to be honest, you know, if we were in front of a group of kids, like that's really where we feel like we're going to make the most impact, and that's what we live to do. That's our job. So we love school visits. I don't know the difference in terms of like the charter and the public and the private. To me, any request that comes in, I'm going to consider. So I don't know how different it is in terms of.
It all comes down to you know, whether it becomes going through the publisher or whether it's going through. But the other thing I would say is a lot of it has nothing to do with the publisher and everything to do with the bookstores. The bookstores are the ones who do all the reaching out to the schools. The publisher, when they set up a tour visit to Boston, it's not the publisher setting up the visit, it's the independent bookstores. So as long as the school has a relationship with an independent bookstore and says, give us your authors when they're coming on tour, that's usually how you end up getting authors to your school.
And usually school librarians too also. I get a lot of requests from school librarians to come visit.
I will say, though, that as someone who interviews a lot of authors for my show, Boston is considered a B town, so not an A town for all these readers and all these schools.
It's very true.
And you have to fight. I have to fight publishers to get authors into town in the studio. They'll say, and you know, this happens all the time.
I don't know why. It's funny because like there is a list of cities that are on every single one of our
Boston
tours.
is not it.
Boston is not.
That's right. So you should know that and be prepared to fight with the. You can make it happen, but you got to push.
Did we answer your question?
Kind of, but I'm really shocked to hear you say that about Boston because I feel like maybe it's just the company you keep. No, Boston. We're steeped in academic.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Full of higher education institutions that are drawing on and prestigious middle schools and public schools and charter schools, and the buzz is about diversity equals academic excellence, and so I can't imagine how.
You're singing my song, but you should hear my conversation with these publishers.
I think it's very
you know.
I don't think it has much to do with the publisher as much as it does to do with their relationship with the bookstores. Everything comes down to, do they have a reliable bookstore that publisher works with to get their authors into their various outlets? And if they don't have that ironclad, that's what makes them hesitant. It has very little to do with the city and everything to do with the bookstores.
I love Boston. I'll come anytime.
Yeah.
So.
Over here.
Hi. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
So I have a question about the idea of books that have already been published. So I have 2 kids, and they're boys, and I had sisters, so boys are totally like alien to me. But anyways, it turns out every like truck, dinosaur, and elephant is male unless it's a mother. And so I started to, from early age, I just always change the he's to she's and the she's to he's, and it's like a totally different feeling. And then I bought a set of markers of different skin colors. I started coloring characters to make them all brown so my kids could relate, because it was always like, Finley's in every book, and where am I? So I was like, can't people work with current publishers and have them republish books with different genders, or republish a book and make the child a different race? Because there's so many old classics or books that everyone reads, and it would be cool to. I tried to write Eric Carle. He didn't write me back.
Hey.
I think it depends on the book, right?
Good luck with that one.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'll go off on a tangent. You know what book I hated? 5 Chinese Brothers. Can't rewrite that one. Well, maybe. Maybe you can rewrite it. I don't know. I mean, is it worth rewriting the stories, or can't we have new ones?
Yeah, that's what I would say.
I think times have changed. We're talking about kids that are facing a whole set of different obstacles too. I think it's time to get rid of the, sorry. Sometimes it's good to get rid of the classics and just, let new voices come in. That's my personal opinion.
All right, over there.
Hi, thank you for being here and for a great discussion. I appreciate what you're doing with We Need Diverse Books. And so much of what has been talked about today, particularly around the idea of challenging certain assumptions that we have about a book with Black characters being for Black individuals, or a book with female characters being for female or women readers. But I must admit that I'm a little struck by the comment about trying to engage young male readers by putting duct tape over female characters. And so while I appreciate trying to, again, challenge those assumptions and draw readers in who might otherwise avoid a particular reading, I wonder if there's a way to do that without leaving the young female readers in the audience or feeling diminished in some way. It almost feels like we're correcting one problem by creating a new one. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
It's funny because it's a specific thing I came up with, and only, I think, because the book is so unabashedly female focused in its main characters, I feel like getting the boys to read that book is the victory. Because once they read that book, I feel like everything takes care of itself, especially because it's just so aggressively, the women are the ones doing all the work in the School for Good and Evil. So I don't know. For me, I feel like anything was worth getting them to let go of, because as we were talking about before, you can't lecture people into picking up a book. Like if I gave them any sort of rational reason to ignore the cover, it wouldn't work. So for me, it was just about getting them to read it. And ultimately, the boys who have read The School for Good and Evil often are our biggest fans, the biggest fans of the series. So I'll do whatever it takes to get them to read it. So I don't know. Like, it's funny, like having lived the life that I've lived and maybe Ellen and Amit have lived, sometimes we resort to slightly unconventional means to shake people out of their ways of doing things. But I don't know. If there's a better way, I'd love to hear it. But for me, that's what got them to buy it.
I always have the thing where they're like, is this a girl book, right? And I'm like, well, is it a girl book if it has like demons that like rip your skin off and eat your insides and then take your skin and wear it like a Halloween costume and like, and I'm like, I just kind of change it up on them and say, well, do you like that kind of story? Is that your story? Yes, okay. Well, it's not a girl story. It's not a boy book. It's a book for anybody. So I think we kind of have to challenge toxic masculinity also.
That's it, because you're battling such a huge battle. I remember, the reason that this story stays in my head is I was in Dayton, Ohio, in the middle of like baseball country. And I was finishing up a signing. And I had done a school visit earlier in the day where I told the duct tape story. And I was finishing, this like 8th grade boy who was a big guy, came in running in his baseball uniform. He's like, did I miss it? Did I miss it? I wanted to get his book. And his dad walked in behind him, and the dad just looked like he didn't want to be there, like could not believe he was coming from the baseball game to get a book. And then he sees the book, right? And I remember the boy looking up at him and being like, he said I could take off the cover, or he said I could like, duct tape the cover or whatever. And I remember like just that moment of the boy having to defend to his father like why he was getting that book, and that stuck with me. So that's what we're facing, unfortunately, not just in obviously the area of the boy-girl gender thing, but also in, like Ellen said, with the race stuff too. So, we do what we have to do, I guess.
Well, that's going to have to be the last one, but before you each exit, I'm going to encourage you to purchase books. I've already bought a whole bunch and given them away, and the kids have loved them, and to have get your book signed by the authors after we give you the exit sign. But I don't want you to leave without having purchased the books, because that is the best distribution of both the ideas and the product. And so give them a round of applause, and then we'll have some closing words.
No one's leaving this room without purchasing a book. All right. So hi folks, I'm Chris Ciotti, those of you who don't know me, and on behalf of the FAS diversity team, thanks so much for coming today. It was such a treat to be here. The time went by so quickly. Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your perspectives and your insights. I know I learned a lot. I think everybody did. And Callie, you make every panel we do so much richer and so much better. Thank you so much. Can we do another round of applause? I think they deserve it. So a couple things to whet your appetite. Our FY18, now in its 8th year, Diversity Dialogue Series will begin this November. And this year's theme, we're kicking it off here today, is storytelling as a way to enhance inclusion. I think you're going to love it. We have some wonderful speakers lined up. And so, you know, as Annie was saying earlier, when you get a chance to tell your story, when you hear about others' stories, the authenticity that comes out of that, the vulnerability, the transparency is so powerful. And it helps our community in so many ways be stronger and more powerful. So watch for more information on that. Let me just grab the book. So the book. So I don't get a chance to read much. I don't know about all of you, but I just somehow don't seem to. And I stumbled across the book about 6 months ago, happily stumbled across it. And I read all the stories. And I really loved them, but I knew they were so meaningful to me because they stayed in my head. They just stayed with me for days and weeks and even months after I read them. And being here today, I want to go back and reread them. And this is for someone who just doesn't get a chance to read that much. So I can't recommend a lot of books, but I certainly can recommend this one. So a couple thank yous. Thank you to my wonderful FAS diversity team, and thank you so much to Andrea Kelton-Harris, to Annie McGough, to Sam Sweeney, because they really made today happen. Thank you guys, as always. We get to stand up here every time and bring these wonderful speakers and programs to you through the leadership and the financial support of Leslie Kerwin and Mike Smith. I don't know if they were able to make it today, but they're here with us every time in this room, and I thank them for that. And as Callie said, the coupe is here, the books are here, the authors are here, and they're very inexpensive. Buy it for yourself and read it and give it to someone else. They will love it. But most important, thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be here today. We very much appreciate it. Go in peace. Have a great weekend, everybody.